Welcome everybody to the RGSQ public lecture. This is a very special lecture this evening, Ken Sutton Memorial Lecture, which I'll say a few words about in a moment. My name's Irafne Childs. I'm the current president of the Royal Geographical Society of Queensland. So again, welcome to our members. Special welcome to non-members joining us this evening. Most welcome, good to see you here. For the non-members, if you are interested in our society, please visit our website. You'd be most welcome to join if you so choose. We have one apology this evening from Professor Steve Turton, who many of you may know. Steve had registered for this evening, but he was flying back from Canberra to Brisbane and his plane was delayed. So he is currently in the air and cannot zoom into us. And I think he doesn't have to quarantine this time when he comes back, so that's good. If I could just remind you, we are recording this evening's presentation. So could you please make sure that you keep your microphones and your cameras turned off during the presentation. Thank you. I'd like to just start this evening by mentioning a few words by way of introduction to the award which we are presenting this evening on Zoom. Ken Sutton was a well-known geographer, teacher in Queensland, founder of both the Geography Teachers Association of Queensland and the Australian Geography Teachers, AGTA. He is a former president of the RGSQ, our society. RGSQ's Ken Sutton Trust serves as a legacy of Ken Sutton's work. It was established via bequest in 1988. It's dedicated to providing a platform for the best geographical or geographical education work by an Australian geographer. And the Memorial Award is promoted through an endowed lecture and presentation, which we're delighted to present to you this evening. So I would like now to introduce our awardee, our winner of this year's Ken Sutton Memorial Award and our speaker for this evening. Delighted to introduce to you tonight Professor Ian Rutherfurd, whom I think many of you may already know. On behalf of RGSQ, Ian, we'd like to offer you our congratulations on this year's award and thank you for accepting the award and doing the presentation this evening. We do hope to invite Ian to come in person to Brisbane next year to receive the award at the Society's premises in Brisbane. Ian is a professor of geography within the School of Geography at the University of Melbourne. He is a fluvial geomorphologist and his research interests relate to processes of erosion and sedimentation in river channels, particularly human impacts on rivers. He has worked for some 25 years in the water sector as an academic, consultant, and in government in Australia, and also on many overseas projects in Southeast Asia, China, USA, Canada, and South Africa. So I think this evening we are in for a very interesting and important talk where Ian will share with us some of his, some aspects of his very important work. So the title of Ian's talk this evening, Geography at the Interface, the Science and Management of Land Along Rivers. Please join me in welcoming Ian to the Zoom podium. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Arafti. I'll just share my screen. Thank you, Arafti, very much for that generous introduction. And I would like to thank the Royal Geographical Society of Queensland for this award that's being presented tonight. But before I do that, do you mind if I acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that I'm on at the moment? I'm down in Victoria, in the west of the city, and I'm on the Wurundjeri people's country. And I just acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'll be talking today about lands that are on the many different Indigenous peoples' country. But I'd also would like to thank Ken Sutton in absentia for the generosity of his bequest in this award as well, and also I guess the honour of following in his legacy, because I won't talk too much about Ken because other people can do that, but he was certainly a dynamic figure. I've been only slightly involved with AGTA, but very much involved with the Geography Teachers Association in Victoria and with many of the organisations that Ken was. So the quote here from his biography is this is not from his biography, this is from the Royal Geographical Society, of which he was a champion. Since 1885, the Society has pursued its main objective of promoting an interest in and a study of geography through publications, field-based research, projects, public lectures and excursions. And I think all of those things are things that we all share and love. And for 14 years, he was a councillor, vice president and president of the Society. I don't think he was those things all at once, even though he was a man of rare energy. So I am delighted to accept this award and present this talk today. So boundaries and interfaces, that's a fundamental part of geography. It's central really to the study of geography, and the idea of a boundary, that you can define things sharply like this map of climatic and vegetation zones in Africa is of course a fiction. We always have boundaries that are transitional, but often those boundaries are also human. So they relate to administrative and political boundaries. And today I'm going to be talking about that topic. We have coasts, which are another form of interface, a boundary between the ocean and the land. This is Warrnambool on the Hopkins River in Victoria. And this is not only a coastal interface, but this is also a very famous site here. If you can see my mouse, there's a place called Moyjul, which is a very famous archaeological site. It's a controversial site too. It's at this place that there's the proposition that Aborigines had occupied this site since for 120,000 years. So that's an intense debate, but it also reminds us that these interfaces were also places of Aboriginal occupation and intensive use, and I'll come back to that point later. We have boundaries of cities and edges of cities and interfaces there. But today I want to talk about this interface. This is a river. I'm going to talk about the interface between fluvial systems and human systems and natural systems, and that's the riparian area. So here we have a boundary in the west of Melbourne between a growing suburb, a river, and then agriculture on the side. So my address tonight is entitled Geography at the Interface, the Science and Management of Land Along Rivers. Now, I've, as was said in the introduction, I'm a fluvial geomorphologist. I work particularly on those fluvial processes, but today I wanted to really track, I suppose, my involvement in riparian zones, not talking so much about the science I've done on them, but more around the management implications of that sort of work. So this will sort of chart a little of the contemporary history of riparian areas, which sort of matches my own history in this area. So it'll be a bit biographical if you'll bear with me. And so this actually started in the mid to late 1980s. I was doing an honours thesis in this area. This is the King Valley in northeastern Victoria, one of my favourite parts of the world. The King Valley, the Ovens Valley, beautiful valleys, and it was a tobacco valley at the time. The tobacco actually ceased in 2007, but it was a rich tobacco area. And the reason I was there was because my teacher and mentor, Professor Brian Finlayson, had suggested there's something going on in this valley. There's some conflict between the tobacco growers, the government, and it's something to do with the rivers moving around. You should go up there because it could be a good honours topic. So I headed up there and started working. And so I'll introduce that in a moment. But what I'm going to do from that start of my career, if you like, is talk about this topic in 4 acts. And the first act is in the 1980s, which is called Your River is Causing Trouble. Act 2 is Discovering the Riparian Zone. Act 3, Harvesting the Low-Hanging Fruit. And then we'll finish with, up to the present day, which is issues of industrial scale protection. Now, I think that the geographers among us will find this an interesting topic because it has all of the drama and story of interactions between environment, public, private. We'll see all of that. And well, also I hope that I'll convince you that the management of riparian zones is emerging as certainly one of the most important environmental issues in Australia. So the first, Act 1, Your River is Causing Trouble. So back to the King River, which is a beautiful river, typical northeastern Victorian river, tobacco kilns, tobacco growing on. Now, my job, so what actually happened there was I went and did the honours thesis, and I had the rare opportunity then of the managers, in those days it was Crown Lands, or the Crown Frontages was the group. They said, well, you've done this honours thesis which talked about rivers and tobacco and channel change and all that sort of stuff. Why don't you come up and work? So I spent 2 years working in the northeast as a Crown Land Management Officer, and what a brilliant job that was. It was, I just travel around the northeast looking at bits of Crown land. I was the gravel inspector, I was the mines inspector, because I had done a bit of earth sciences, and it was a very dangerous time for the community, but a great time for me. So travelling around, working on the tobacco, and that's where I learned very quickly the difference between theory and practice, of course, because I'd been doing all this work on how the rivers had changed and the tobacco and the river frontage, which is a very different thing from fronting up to a tobacco farmer and telling them that 25% of their crop was growing on public land, and also telling them that it was not a good idea to wash out your dieldrin and pesticide tubs in the river because you just killed all the fish. They were the sort of days. It was a pretty cowboy time. But the King River is a bit of a cowboy river as well. It's a dynamic river, lots of erosion, avulsions, channel change, and that's the sort of environment that we're talking about. And so we've got dynamic rivers with static boundaries. That's one of the themes I want to touch on here. This is this is Narrial Creek, but a nearby creek, and the purple line is the present course of the river. The blue line is the Crown Frontage, and that's got a dynamic boundary. And I want to just briefly touch on the question of boundaries and how they move. You'll notice up in the north at the top of that image there's no Crown Frontage, but there is in the bottom. And that's very typical of these messy rivers. So we've got migration, we've got avulsion, we've got a 20-metre permanent reservation, which is common in Victoria, and it was made in 1881. A lot of Crown Frontage in Victoria. In New Zealand, they call that the Queen's Chain because they have the same thing in New Zealand. But there are also these meets and bounds boundary, which is their boundary on the western side, there on the eastern side, where we can see a broader area of frontage here and a 20-metre boundary on the, actually that's the left bank. So unlike elsewhere, the boundaries do not move with the river in Victoria, and the bed and banks are always Crown land, and they do actually move, but the other boundaries don't. So you end up with a complete mess. But if you think about it, this pattern, this situation where we've got a river frontage against agriculture, high value dynamic agriculture, is really designed to maximise conflict. We've got a public asset, which is the river and the frontage, butting up against a private asset, which then produce impacts downstream. We've got a long and thin river, which maximises edge effects, highly valuable agriculture, using water, accessing water, and floodplain soils, and really the closer you get to the stream, the richer the soils. It's a dynamic river that's moving, and we have floods, high energy floods, again, a site of conflict. And that conflict is made worse because all the time the government is trying to assist the landholders to reduce that impact of the flooding by doing things to the river, which we're all familiar with, channelizing, improvements, they called them at the time, desnagging, which is removing large wood. These are some big logs that were pulled out in the 1930s from the King River, huge logs, and all designed to get the water away faster, which of course increased the velocity, increased the channel change, increased the avulsion risk, and made everything worse, but then increased the conflict. The result of this experience working on the King River was a lifelong interest I've had in dynamic river channels, and I've had the good fortune to travel around the planet looking at rivers. I've worked on the Mississippi River on the left, on many rivers around the world, recently on the Han River in China, a very dynamic river, the main tributary of the Yangtze River. Now, I'm not going to talk about that work, dynamic rivers, much as I'd like to, but I'm going to talk about the consequences for rivers, for the land next to it, and talk about ambulatory boundaries first. What happens to boundaries when the river moves around? Now, we've all heard of the doctrine of accretion and avulsion. If I could, I'd do a test here. Who knows what diluvian and reliction means? Because every good geomorphologist should. So diluvian is actually the opposite of accretion. So accretion is the gradual deposition of material. Diluvian, believe it or not, is the gradual erosion of material. Reliction is where the boundary moves by the water moving. So you imagine the sea goes out or the lake level falls. Your boundary then can move with that change in water level. And avulsion, of course, is where the river jumps into a new course. Now, since Roman times, we've had this doctrine that if the river moves gradually and imperceptibly, then the river moves with it. The boundary moves with it. If the river moves suddenly, that is via an avulsion, then the boundary remains where it was. So that's the principle. Unfortunately, it really rarely works in Australia. It's a bit of a mess. For Victoria, the only true of a few types of boundaries. I did a quick survey here of all the places that many of you will live, what happens to boundaries of rivers in different states. So in Victoria, if it's a boundary, then the bed and banks are Crown land, and it's one chain either side, but only the bed and bank moves. Nothing else does. And when I was in government, I spent 5 years working in government in Victoria, and I did my very best to get those boundaries to move, to get a legal opinion that said they moved, and I failed. In Western Australia, if it's a boundary, then it's Crown land on the bed and banks of the river. New South Wales is owned by adjacent landholder to the centre of the stream in most cases. Queensland is actually a complicated case. I'll talk about that in a moment. In New Zealand, they introduced in 1987 this beautiful rule, which we should have everywhere on every river, which is where they call them marginal strips, where every time your title changes, you put a marginal strip, the land gets sold, you put a 20-metre buffer on it, and that marginal strip moves with the river. A brilliant idea. And so progressively, they will have 20-metre strips along all of their rivers as land changes hand. It's a beautiful piece of policy, and it's a lovely piece of management. So just quickly, in Queensland, the special case, they changed the law recently because under the Water Act and the Land Act in 2000, the Everything between the banks of the river is Crown land or public land. However, in Queensland, as many of you will know, the rivers are weird and they have these macro channels like Lockyer Creek and even the parts of the Brisbane River. All up the east coast, you've got these macro channels, huge river channels with little inset streams inside them. And so in this case, the top of the bank is not the channel down here, it's actually the top of the trench, which is good. And I think there's some claims being made on that land. So different in Queensland. So the result of all of this is that over time you get crazy accretion of tenure, and there's no more complicated boundaries than riparian boundaries in Victoria in this case. Every one of those colours means a different land status. You know, permanently reserved, temporary reserve, committees of management. It's just crazy. This is the Ovens River, near Myrtleford in this case. So to finish Act 1, your river is causing trouble. So in this case, up to the 1980s, river frontages were seen as a zone of conflict in which the state's rivers were disrupting agriculture. And this was very much the mood in the King Valley, that tobacco farmers were forever angry at government because their river was disturbing their agriculture, erosion, avulsion, and so on. And then the government and the landholders would work together to stabilise and tame these unruly rivers. That was the same across all of Victoria and across most of Australia, the same up to this time. So public-private interests were generally aligned with the river, and riparian areas were seen as problems. And dynamic frontages became a progressively more complex legal entity where you can never be sure what the status of the land is along rivers. And this is not just in the high energy rivers of the north, it's across to all the streams of Australia. And I haven't even talked about the crazy anabranching, anastomosing rivers of Australia, where the rivers are all over the place and no one even knows which is the main channel. That would be a topic for a whole nother evening. Let's move to Act 2 now, discovering the riparian zone. So at the end of the 80s and into the 90s, there was an explosion of interest in these areas. No one even knew what riparian zone meant back then. I'd never really heard the term until the late 80s. If you talk to landholders about it, they'd say, the what? And this really coincided with a fantastic organisation called the Land and Water Australia, and also cooperative research centres I was fortunate to be involved with after I'd done my PhD and come back from America. So I was working with the Cooperative Research Centre for Catchment Hydrology, and one of the things we got was a big block of funding. We got about 5 years of funding, believe it or not, from Land and Water Australia to investigate riparian zones. And this were halcyon days of research. We just did stacks of stuff with many of the colleagues that you know around Australia. And it was all about interactions between rivers and vegetation. Before that really hadn't been explored particularly. And so, as you know, to start with, we began to recognise that riparian zones were special. And this seems a bit twee now with hindsight, but at the time this was exciting revelation that riparian zones are among the most diverse, dynamic and complex ecosystems on Earth. They're an interface between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Their biotic composition, geomorphology, hydrology, microclimate and fuel load arrangements and chemistry are often much different than the surrounding uplands. Riparian zones are often sites of increased natural disturbance, such as floods, while simultaneously functioning as buffers or barriers to other natural disturbance, polluted runoff, natural fire breaks. And so we can see that bottom graph there, the number of species tends to decline as you move away from the stream, and lots of more research done demonstrating that these days. I won't go over this diagram, it just demonstrates the amazing explosion of interest and research that went into riparian attributes, the links with aquatic and terrestrial ecological functions, and the special character of these lands we now sort of take for granted, but this is a very recent intellectual phenomenon. Just to touch on a couple of these, the incredible research that was done at the time by Stuart Bunn, Peter Davies and other colleagues in Queensland on the influence of riparian zones on the basic character of Australian streams. And that was because of shade and because of food resources. So I won't go into this too much, but fundamentally what happens when you clear riparian zones off is you switch them from a detrital carbon basis to an algal carbon, and that is driven by low water temperatures and high detrital inputs from the riparian zone. That's things like insects and leaves and organic material. And then when you clear the vegetation, the water heats up, warm water and lower detrital inputs flicks it into an algal dominated state driven by high nutrients from agriculture. And that's really the foundation of a lot of the work we do in riparian zones, is trying to switch the stream back into its more natural state. And riparian functions are critical for that in Australian streams. And here's some water temperature work done in southeast Queensland. A big experiment we did, we're looking at the revegetation of a whole catchment, showing that you could get the water temperature down below the lethal limit for insects. We did a stack of research around riparian processes, interactions between rivers and vegetation, bank erosion, large wood in rivers, the dynamics, hydraulics, recovery rates. We looked at avulsions, and we looked at impacts of vegetation on flooding. Buffer widths, of course, were a big topic. How wide should your riparian zone be? And it's still an issue now. And I'd love to talk about all of those things, and maybe I can a different day, but here's just a couple of examples. This is a really interesting one, is the effect of riparian vegetation in slowing flood waves. So we did some of the first work on this in the world, actually, showing with my student Brett Anderson, showing just how much you can slow flood waves down through valleys as they go down. You can actually have a big effect on flood heights further down the valley, and that's been used in lots of places for flood management now, particularly in the UK, where they're using vegetation to reduce flooding through the whole network. And this is some recent work showing that depending where you put the riparian vegetation in the catchment, you can decouple your hydrograph peaks. So a peak comes down each tributary. If you slow it in one tributary with a bit of resistance from riparian vegetation, you can have a huge, pretty substantial, 6% decrease in the peak outlet, which actually leads to a 5.9% decrease in the peak and up to 20%. So it's a really important observation, and if you like, an ecosystem service that comes from riparian vegetation. And of course, riparian areas buffer pollution from agriculture. This is a big rationale for managing riparian areas. This is sugarcane on the Herbert River, where we did a lot of experimental work looking at pollution from sugarcane. But this is one of my great passions, if you like, is cows in rivers. And in fact, one of the things I hope to achieve in the few years before I die is getting these mongrels out of rivers. So this is some really nice work done early on that shows a condition score on the y-axis against cow pat density. And basically, the more cow pats you have, the worse the condition of the riparian zone for all sorts of functions. And so that's for private properties, crown land, and state forest. This was sort of the first study that demonstrated the degrading impact of cows on water quality and all sorts of functions, on basically everything to do with the health of the riparian zone. And what happens if you fence it out and you get the stock out? Well, again, some really groundbreaking research. This is by Lucy McCurgo and Ian Prosser, a study in Western Australia funded by Land and Water Australia, looking at what happens if you fence out the whole catchment from cows. And that red arrow there shows the point where they fenced it out, and it's just a spectacular decrease in both suspended sediment loads, nutrients, both nitrogen and phosphorus in this case. So demonstrating the effectiveness of doing that. This is a more recent empirical study. I'll just mention this because it's very relevant to you people in southeast Queensland, that we've got a Moreton Bay. This is work by John Olley and Griffith University, where it was a huge study. They looked at 22 subcatchments and just looked at water quality. So they looked at nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, suspended sediment, and they found that out of all the predictors they put in, which included things like catchment slope, total stream length, area of grazing land, area of cropping, area of horticulture, the only variable that fell out as controlling the amount of these pollutants was the proportion of remnant vegetation and the proportion of the stream length that was draining remnant vegetation. So this figure shows the total suspended sediment ratio. Don't worry about that's a non-dimensional variable. Total phosphorus ratio, total nitrogen. And what this shows is the proportion of the stream network draining remnant woody vegetation, and this vertical line shows the present riparian vegetation proportion, which is about 20%. And it shows how much extra riparian vegetation you need to get to fully return the stream to its natural ratio. So the fundamental conclusion here is no remnant vegetation. You've got 50 to 200 times the total suspended solids of a fully vegetated channel. And to halve the total suspended solids, you need to revegetate 37% of the riparian vegetation. Total phosphorus, it's 40%. Nitrogen's much tougher. It's 95%. And there's all sorts of... Nitrogen is a complex beast that riparian vegetation can or can't affect. So it's really interesting stuff. New research that's coming out now is also showing just how important riparian zones are for carbon, for organic carbon and carbon in catchment systems. So work from the US suggests that valley floors hold 25% of the carbon storage in the entire catchment for just 1% of the landscape. That's both in soil, floodplain carbon, and in vegetation. And then for red gum riparian forest, this work by Marasini and Mitchell shows that you can get an average of 120 tonnes of carbon per hectare. Now that's a lot. That tends to be about 4 times the amount that you'll get from just an open woodland forest. Now, if there was a carbon market, if we was, I suppose, sophisticated enough in Australia to actually have a carbon market, riparian zones would pay for themselves. And I'm going to come back to that point later on. It's already been demonstrated in the US with some really lovely studies that you can get really big money from the carbon stored in riparian zones if you revegetate them. We also increasingly recognised through the 90s the role of riparian zones, erosion, instability, nutrients, pesticides, all of that stuff from the catchments on major receiving waters. The Great Barrier Reef, Moreton Bay in South Queensland, Swan River in Western Australia, the Torrens in South Australia, in Victoria, Queensland, Corner Inlet, Gippsland Lakes. Lots of examples all over the place that receiving waters are being degraded because of degraded riparian function. At the same time, and this is the last point in Act 2, is we have an appreciation, a growing appreciation of the long association between humans and rivers. So we've managed to screw our rivers up pretty royally in 200 years, and yet we were doing this job down on the Werribee River recently. Werribee is just outside my window, actually, here in west of Melbourne. And when they put this regional rail link through, they had to look at the cultural values along the way. And so they dug up a 1 metre square pit where that pylon is, and they found 1,387 artefacts in that pit. Just unbelievable. In some of the pits in this area, they were finding 10,000 artefacts per cubic metre. Now that's just incredible. And that's a 6,000-year occupation history, because it got so cold here at the peak of the last glacial that they all left. mean, some people would say that Werribee is a pretty miserable place to live nowadays, but it was pretty cold at the peak of the last glacial. So that is mirrored all across Australia. Rivers and riparian zones is where Indigenous people lived quite sensibly. And so they have a long association, and that's really just being appreciated now. So Act 2, we're discovering the riparian zone. And again, this sounds a bit odd. It's taken for granted now that this is the case, but this is a very recent discovery, if you like, the power of and importance of riparian zones. So before, in Act 1, we were protecting the landholders from the river. We then have an explosion of evidence of the value of the riparian zone, the value in its own right, the value for the river, the value for communities, the value for Indigenous societies. There's an explosion of evidence of how it's being degraded, the evidence of how it's degrading receiving waters at the bottom as well. So suddenly we need to protect the riparian zone and the rivers from the people, particularly from cows and from cropping and its associated pollutants. Now, I want to emphasize here, I'm not saying that that first point has gone away. We still have to protect landholders from rivers. There's still all sorts of interactions between rivers and humans around flooding and erosion, all sorts of things that continue. So the story I'm telling tonight of riparian zones is a story of accumulating complexity. It was complex enough where we just had boundaries and landholders and those sorts of conflicts. Now we have valuable riparian zones that we need to protect from the humans on the other side of the fence, or the no fence. So let's move to Act 4, which I call harvesting the low-hanging fruit. There was an explosion in grant funding, if everyone recalls, from 1997. They sold Telstra, and John Howard was generous enough to give us a bit of money from that for the Natural Heritage Trust. Land care started. There was an explosion of programs and funding at national scale for the environment. And I was, not at this time, but from 2009 to 2014, I was coming out of the university, and I spent 5 years as working in government as, a senior manager. I was the director for River Health for Victoria, so responsible for the health and condition of the state's streams, where riparian management was front and centre in that job, and the millions and millions of dollars that were being sloshed around the place. The result of all of that is that now fencing and revegetation of riparian zones is the most common environmental activity in Australia. It's not the most expensive, I'll come to that, it's the most frequent. So every weekend you'll see across the continent people down on riparian zones, school kids planting trees and people fencing out agriculture and cows. Now, environmental flows, as you know, is the most expensive ecosystem environmental activity in Australia, costing, well, various estimates, but certainly $12 billion. The next most expensive and prolific is riparian zones, which is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Why? What is it that's about riparian zones that means it gets that attention? Well, it's those processes and functions I talked about, but there are also political and social reasons. There are multiple and some private benefits. And so because you see so many of these benefits and so many of these values, and you also see some private benefits, people think they're doing a good thing, which they are when they get involved in these projects. It's relatively inexpensive per unit. You know, fences aren't that expensive. Revegetation is cheap, particularly if you get school kids to do it. Everyone can join in, and it's politically easy, and there's actually not that many hard decisions to make. And that's a key point here. That's why I'm talking about the low-hanging fruit here. This is the easy stuff. Get the school kids to plant a few trees. If you can persuade the landholder, we'll put up a fence. It's the people's environmental activity. We also connect longitudinally as well as laterally, and this is a really lovely example from the Atherton Tablelands, where they have linked Crater Lakes National Park to a second national park. It's a sort of a bio-link. So it's not just horizontal benefits, but also longitudinal ones as well. More geography. Indigenous values are now represented. So under the Aboriginal Heritage Act in Victoria, any activity that disturbs land within 200 metres either side of a named waterway requires a cultural heritage permit. If you're going to dig a hole or do something, you've got to get a cultural heritage permit. So recognising the Indigenous interests along waterways. However, this is the key thing, almost entirely this program is delivered by willing landholders subsidised by grants. So government gives devolved grants, it might be a market-based instrument, it might be an offset, whatever it is, it's still paid for at least 50% by government. This is an example on King Parrot Creek, a beautiful 20-year-old riparian zone fenced out. Actually, this is within what I might call the hobby farm zone out of Melbourne. Within 2 hours of Melbourne, pretty well everything nowadays is owned by Melbourne lawyers, doctors and professionals. So there's stacks of stuff going on across the country. These are some of them. The Lochra Creek Catchment Action Plan in the northern York Peninsula in South Australia. We've got the Bunyip River Action Plan in Western Australia, in the southwest. We've got the Tamar Estuary in Tasmania, Riparian Action Strategy for the Clarence Valley in New South Wales, a great strategy, that one, if you want to read a good one. We've got Riparian Intervention Monitoring Program in Victoria, Regional Riparian Action Plan in Victoria. So all this stuff going on across the country in riparian areas, and it's extremely difficult to know, though, how much is being done. I know for Victoria, because they have the numbers, but the rest of the states is a bit of a mystery. In Victoria, in the last 15 years, we've had done 10,000 kilometres fenced and revegetated. A further 4,000 kilometres under this latest RAP program, a $30 million program to the present. It's about $10,000 per kilometre, which is pretty inexpensive, actually. That's the fence cost for one side of a river, typically. Now, the priority streams in Victoria, there's only 30,000 kilometres because it's such a small state, and nearly half of those are nearly fenced and revegetated. It's an incredible success. And we can compare that with the world's longest fence, which is the rabbit-proof fence from Queensland to South Australia. It's 5,600 kilometres. So it's not a bad length of fencing. But there are real problems with all of this. There's problems of maintenance. The government paid for the fence. Who's responsible for maintaining it? Supposedly the landholder. Well, it's not always working that well. In Queensland, they fence off all these areas to protect the reef, these gullies, and the landholders then say, well, your fence is down. When are you going to come and fix it? Well, we haven't got budget to fix it. A fundamental problem of riparian management, of course. I just want to mention one example here quickly, which is that it sounds really simple to do something like fence out a frontage at large scale. But I just want to give you one case study here of why it's actually really can be complicated. And this relates to this geography of this place. So let's imagine in Victoria that we decide we want to fund landholders to fence off their river frontages, which we do. The problem is that under the Water Act, it guarantees adjacent landholders access to water for their stock, but I won't talk any more about that. But if you fence it off, it means that stock cannot access the water. It's not just that they can't pump the water, they aren't allowed to use the water anymore. The right to it is lost. Therefore, if you put up a fence, you now need a water licence for pumped water. Water licences are capped in the Murray-Darling Basin. So if you're north of the Divide, actually most of the catchments in Victoria now, you can't get a water licence. So if you fence off the frontage, the landholder can't any longer get water from the stream. Therefore, when we went through all this process, we had to get a special exemption negotiated with the water authorities. We had to get the Murray-Darling Basin to expand the cap at catchment level to allow us to fence, and then we had to get discounts for those landholders, because otherwise you've got to pay multiple licence fees, water volume, maintenance fees, pump licence fees. What landholder is going to fence off their frontage if you ask them to under those circumstances? We did actually explore getting temporary water trades of the water that they got, and that was a slight benefit of getting a riparian licence. My point here is that because of the complexity of water and riparian zones, nothing is simple. So let's I'll just quickly point out something here, which is that even without anybody doing anything, without any of us doing anything, riparian zones are revegetating at a pretty rapid rate. And that's just because we've stopped clearing them. So in New South Wales, it's predicted, or it's estimated that 8 to 34% increase in woody vegetation since 1978. And this is a map that just came out the last few days from the ANU, which is where you can show the change in woody vegetation, the closed canopy from 1990 to 2020, over 30 years. The red is the area that's just been lost in bushfires, and the blue is the area of 50% increase in canopy. Look at the riparian zones here. All the rivers are not burned, and they're all growing in vegetation and canopy cover. And that's a trend just because we stopped clearing them. And that's really a rule in management, is stopping doing dumb things is often more important than restoration activities. So, Act 3. Let me finish off this one. The low-hanging fruit. Fencing and revegetating riparian areas is now probably the most common environmental activity in Australia. We're reaching tens of thousands of kilometres. However, we have, how many kilometres of stream do we have in Australia? Well, in Victoria, we have 300,000 minimum, and 30,000 of that we actively manage, really. There's millions of kilometres of streams. Now, we don't have to revegetate all of the riparian zone, but we have to increase the scale. This is almost entirely done by willing landholders subsidised by government grants. There's issues of maintenance, because if the government pays, is the landholder going to maintain it? And there are lots of interesting parallels here we'll be able to talk about later on with water buybacks in the Murray-Darling Basin, with fishing licence buybacks. This is just another example of over-allocation. We've over-allocated riparian land that we need back for public benefits. We have to pay to get it back. So what's next? And let me finish with the Act 4, which is the industrial scale protection. How are we going to scale up the stuff we're talking about to make a more substantial impact? And there's options to increase scale. Now, there's the two binary views here. Often people will say, particularly in Victoria, where we've got so much Crown land, just demand that landholders fence out the frontage. The same as your front gate in your house, you have to build a fence to the road. Well, all farmers should do the same thing. And remember, Queensland is 65% public leasehold on average, sometimes in some catchments up to 90% leasehold land, where you have some control over what people do with it. So you could force people to manage frontages properly. The counter argument for that from the VFF and other landholder stewards is that landholders are the stewards of the river, and they're the best placed managers of riparian land, and that is true. They're also the first to degrade riparian land, and so we have to get some benefit there. So there's public first, private first. Let's have a look at some options. Let's have some other options. One key thing that we can pursue, and that we're doing all over the place, is making good management pay. The second thing is to use industry standards, and I'll just touch on New Zealand as an example. And then there's global push for what's called the room for the river approach. Let the rivers have more space. But it's true that even in the highest priority areas in the country, which at the moment is the catchment of the Great Barrier Reef, at least $300 million is being spent on that catchment, is the plan. 40% of excess erosion originating from gully erosion comes from just 0.1% of the catchment area, and those are streams, gully areas and streams. Yet there is no push for landholders not to graze it. It's all voluntary. We can buy the land back, we can use reef credits, we can pay landholders not to graze. There's still no compulsion pretty well anywhere in Australia yet. We can use financial incentive to manage the riparian zone. We can simply increase licence fees. Now, this is a very easy one to do, leasehold land. At the moment, we actually subsidise private activities on public land. The licence fees in Victoria don't cover the cost of administering the licence fee, the licence payments. It's a scandal, actually. So we're subsidising the degradation of our rivers and riparian zones. If we increase the licence fees, now that's a politically difficult thing to do in Australia because of the politics of national parties and all that sort of stuff, but not impossible. Second, we can demonstrate that fenced riparian areas actually increase property values, and they definitely do. And I'll just give an example in a moment. We can explore financial benefits of flood protection, the fact that you can protect areas downstream, and that has a monetary benefit. We can allow farmers to monetize the carbon. As I mentioned, it's already economic in the US. This is an interesting example that shows that riparian management improves rural property values. A really nice study by Polyakov in northeastern Victoria, north central I should say. We looked at hobby farms and different sized properties. And this, I'll just summarize this graph. What it basically tells us is that the bigger the farm, the more farm-like the farm, the less vegetation improves the value. That's because it's usually used by farmers. But as farms get smaller, they're normally bought by hobby farmers, and the more vegetation you have, the more the land is worth up to some point. So if you've got 37% coverage on a 10-hectare farm, you'll get a 16% increase in property value. So riparian areas can increase property values, and that can be a lever. I should say there's all sorts of monetary activities we can look at around riparian areas, and that's just a few of them. If we manage the economics of it properly, that's a real lever to manage them properly. Another aspect here is the industry-driven national riparian standards, and New Zealand is a great case study. This is a riparian area, and it's not a typical one in New Zealand, as we'll see. It's a beautiful little site. In 2001, there was a dirty dairying campaign pushed by the Fish and Game NGO, and that was a spectacular change in the view of New Zealanders of dairying. Before that, everyone had loved dairying as their major export industry, but the Fish and Game groups had seen the degradation of waterways as dairying expanded, and New Zealanders are paying too high a price for their milk. Oh, sorry. And I'll finish in a moment. So this is the 2003 first dairy accord. So Fonterra was so shocked by this accord, and they had such a bad reputation that they formed the first dairy accord with government agencies, and they committed to getting all dairy cows fenced out from streams. And by 2015, 96% had been fenced out. Now, this is a typical one here. You can see the pathetic little frontage we've got there, 1 metre wide, but it still works. It still keeps the cows out of the stream. And by 2030 now, the government has committed to having all stock out of all waterways in the country. And this is a big issue in New Zealand because of green exports and because of tourism and because of the rapid degradation of their water quality. A national cost-benefit analysis was done, this paper by Dynamie, and you can see that there's a very clear national cost-benefit of 1.4 to 22.4 is the benefit-cost ratio of fencing out riparian areas. So it's a very clear national priority now for that reason. Now, I should say there's all sorts of reasons why that wouldn't work, particularly in Australia, but the principle of an industry-driven pressure, driven by all sorts of international imperatives of reputation, is a very powerful tool in managing the intersection between public and private interests in riparian land. Particularly in dairying, beef is a different problem. Finally, room for the river. Now, I'm just mentioning these because these are growing across the world now in lots of countries. The idea that rivers need room is a pretty obvious point. You need room for flooding, you need room for erosion, you need room for biological functions and riparian zones. So in the Netherlands, they've not only bought back all the land along the sides of the rivers and made room. They've actually dug out the old floodplains and wetlands to make more space for floods and reinstate wetlands and things. An incredible program across 20 major rivers in the Netherlands. Now, this is, in a sense, we already have room for river in Victoria because we've got crown frontages and we're not using that well enough. But the whole idea of a corridor which is set aside for rivers, it doesn't have to take all the private land, but this is going to be something that's going to emerge in coming years. It's interestingly now, it's also being pushed by superannuation companies in Victoria, where they're buying up properties and actually allowing floodwaters to go on them and then charging people for reduced flood risk. It's a really genius idea. Okay, so let me finish. Act 4, landscapes and landscape scale change. So we need better balance between private and public benefits and costs in riparian zones. How do we move beyond what we have now, which is voluntary government subsidised fencing and revegetation? We need a combination of actions. We need to make it worthwhile to keep stock out and manage riparian zones. Either make it too expensive to do it or make the riparian zones more valuable. There's lots of options. We need to demand higher standards on public land, and that can come from industry groups and best management practice. We need to demand higher standards of industry groups such as New Zealand, and we can learn a lot there. And finally, we can think about room for the river as a bigger file. Now, my last point here is I've only talked really about the humid parts of Australia. As we know, the great majority of streams in Australia look more like this. They're the anabranching and anastomosing streams of Central Australia. This is Sturt Creek. This is the big anabranching systems. Now, grazing and stock are the biggest impact on these waterways. There is impact from groundwater extraction, but across the continent, 80% of these streams are impacted by grazing. It's Australia's biggest export industry, and that's a whole nother problem, how we manage grazing in that. And an interesting development here is this one, virtual fencing for stock exclusion, where you put these collars on your animals and you can keep them away from certain areas. This is a nice experiment at the bottom here, where you can see there's no virtual fencing at the bottom. Then you put the collars on and they don't go across this line because they get an electric shock from the collar. Eventually they use a noise. So instead of giving them a shock, they just have to use a beep, and that's enough because they think they're going to get a Pavlovian response. But as soon as they took away the electric shock, the cows were back in. In fact, in 2 hours, they were back into their riparian area. So I think this is an exciting development for grazing management across the whole continent. So let me finish with this point. The geography of the interface, binaries and collisions around the riparian interface. I'd say these are the ones that we can recognise. We have private and public conflict or intersection over this space. We have stability and dynamism, where we talk about boundary problems and how we define boundaries and ownership in this riparian space between rivers and private land. We have conflict between production and environmental values, between the local and the regional and the global. Local interests on the river versus interests up and down valley and in receiving waters. We've got rural versus urban. Often because it's urban people who are often worried about this and rural people who have to live with it. And we've got past practices and values against new values. Each of these processes conflict and are in contact in the riparian zone. We've also got observation against expertise, and I certainly experience this when I go out in the field. Because everybody lives along waterways, their observations are often much more credible than those of, knobs from the city, particularly university types. All of those binaries and collisions are in the riparian interface. So to finish, I argue that riparian zones represent quintessential geography. We often talk about physical and human geography. We talk about how geography is defined by this interaction between human, social, political, economic elements. I would argue that there are some places on the face of the earth where these are particularly the case, and I would propose to you tonight that riparian zones are one of those places. So I'll finish there. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Is anybody still there? Oh, you're on mute, Daphne.
Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. That's wonderful. I think there's some claps coming around from people who have zoomed in. Thank you. What a fantastic example of geography in the practical sense, and utilizing all your expertise, your theoretical expertise, and your field work. What a fantastic presentation, an example of how geography contributes to the management of such an important part of our environment. But I think, Ian, you're happy to take some questions?
Of course, very happy.
So I'm going to monitor if people would like to start putting up their questions here, and we'll certainly feed them through to you. So I'm looking at the chat there, but maybe I'll start off, just start the ball rolling with a question here. And obviously, from your work overseas and in Australia, there's major differences, but also some major commonalities. What would you say are, a couple of the, one on each side, perhaps, commonalities of the management problems that you've found between Australia and overseas, and perhaps one of the major differences?
Yes, there's an interesting distinction, I think, between what I'd call colonial societies and perhaps ancient societies. So if we imagine somewhere like China, Southeast Asia, where you've had people living in the riparian zone and interacting with the river for thousands of years, for many thousands of years, it's a very different environment in which you can look at management, as opposed to the colonial societies where and a whole structure was imposed. And so New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States are good examples, parts of South America as well, where Indigenous groups were displaced, and we superimposed a new arrangement. In those places, there's a lot of commonality in the riparian issues I've been talking about. If we visited Canada, if we visited New Zealand, those colonial places have very similar situation, very similar management arrangements, colonial law, riparian law, and things are not too dissimilar. North America is very similar again, and so it means that we can learn a lot from these other places, not so much probably from what I'd call the ancient societies.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I hadn't thought of that, indeed. We have a question now from Annie Lau, who's a lecturer at the UQ. She says, what's the carbon market? Is this concept used in Australia?
Yes.
What it means with regard to, riparian zones in particular.
Yes, thanks. And so in some places where they include a full market accounting for carbon, they include organic carbon, natural carbon. You'll see that in Australia is often including soil carbon in its accounting. If you have a carbon market, then and you store carbon as opposed to using it, then you can claim that as a credit. And when I was working in government, this was back in 2010, if you recall, we did have the vestigial carbon market under the Labor government at the time, and carbon was they called it a carbon tax, but it was actually a price on carbon that you could trade and you could store. There was quite an early days of that. we were exploring the opportunities in Victoria of using stored carbon in riparian zones. What you'd do is you'd revegetate it, and then you would be able to claim that stored carbon as a credit. The problem was the accounting is so rigorous and the riparian zone is so skinny that it ended up costing too much. You'd have to have a very simple carbon accounting system to make it worth doing for riparian zones, even though they're so dense in carbon. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
I should say in North America there is a carbon market. If you store carbon, you can claim it as a carbon credit, and you can it's like a stock market, and riparian zones are already getting involved in that market.
Okay, a couple more questions have come forward from James Hanson. What is the cost of equipping cattle with electric sensors and building a virtual fence compared with constructing and maintaining wired fencing? That's such an interesting example at the end you gave there.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's still pretty experimental. There's a bunch of papers coming out at the moment, and the company that's building this have just got permission. Actually, in Victoria, they were banned. They were banned because of concerns about animal cruelty, but the electric shocks turn out to be pretty modest, and they learn pretty quickly, and then you just have to use the little sound. And compared to an electric fence, they're actually pretty mild, so I don't think they're really a problem. Now, what does it cost? So for fencing, it costs about $25,000 a kilometre if you're going to do both sides of the stream. So about $12,500 a kilometre for your basic fence in Victoria at the moment, around that sort of number. It would, and I've asked this question before about what it costs for these the sensors on the cows, but they say, well, they're not in production really yet, so they're still really expensive. I think they're looking at a couple of $100 per cow, which is really not economical yet. But the idea is that once you've got so many cows in this country that it could become economical once you get to scale. But at the moment, I don't think it is economical.
So many vast distances, certainly with the bees.
Yeah, but it's pretty incredible to see. Like you have an iPad and you just draw a line with your finger where you don't want the cows to go. It's amazing, and I think it's going to be revolutionary for environmental protection if it comes off. It's something we should all look at. Okay,
a question from Ken Granger. There is an old adage that nature is the problem and engineering is the solution. How does that match your approach to management of the riparian zone?
Yes, well, I've certainly got plenty of respect for engineers working in rivers and the work that they do. But in this case, I wouldn't say there are engineering aspects to this question around fencing and even the things like cows. But this is deeply a social and economic problem around riparian areas. I will say there are some really interesting developments in engineering around new styles of fencing, things like fall-down fencing, they call it flood fencing, where they don't get damaged. That's great engineering. But this one is, there's also engineering, of course, around how to manage your stock better in dairy farms and things like that. But this is more fundamentally a problem of economics and social perception.
Okay. Annie just commented, thank you for the explanation earlier on carbon market. Yes, that's a lot of work to quantify carbon storage. That's just a comment. Now a question from Duncan Cook at the Australian Catholic University here in Brisbane. Really enjoyed your talk. Thanks, Ian, and congratulations on the award. By the way, Duncan is a member of our Sutton Selection Committee. And his comment here, it was great to learn of your interest in cows and their impact on riparian zones. Are you aware of any current research quantifying the geomorphic impact of cows or other hard-hoofed animals in Australia?
Yes, thanks, Duncan. Thanks for the question and the congratulations. There are some famous papers in geomorphology. There's one called "The Cow as a Geomorphic Agent," and I have been thinking I must update that paper because there's a lot of new work coming in around the impact of cows, both on the direct impact and also on compaction. And I see there's a question coming up about Northern Australia. There's a lot of really good work done on the impact of stock and the paths they walk and their impact on watering points. Probably not as much work as we'd like in Australia, but there's a lot in New Zealand, a huge amount, and there's also a huge amount in North America. And if you'd like some papers, I'm very happy to provide those. In fact, I was out on the river the other day and saw an impact that I hadn't thought of, Duncan, which was it was breeding time and all the ducks had all the little ducklings and there was a dead duckling squashed by their big hoof. So that's another impact.
Okay, I think you're certainly raising our perception of cows here tonight, Ian. Question from Neil O'Connor. How do we overlay this on Northern Australian stations, which are 500,000 to 1 million acres, which could have tens of thousands of kilometres along waterways? Yeah,
that's a great question, Neil, and it's sort of the bigger question. It's interesting there's some work that's mapped the protection of waterways in Australia, and ironically, and the definition of a protected waterway is where its catchment is protected and there are no dams on it. And ironically, there are more streams in the wet coast of Australia that are protected than there are in the arid zone, and that's because the catchments are bigger, and we haven't got as sophisticated a reserve network. So I do think that if we in 20 years' time we're going to look back on this, we're going to say the most important rivers in Australia are the big arid zone ones, and they're the ones we should have been protecting instead of, well, we're putting a lot of effort into the Murray-Darling Basin, of course, and that's quite legitimate. But meanwhile, I suspect, I don't know, that there's a lot of degradation going on in those places. So I can't answer your question apart from saying that there is research that shows the concentration of stock around water in the Cooper Basin, in the far north, and that's quite predictable that wherever there's water, the cows will wreck it. And because the water is so precious and has to last through the areas, it's often the degradation of those core water supplies that is critical, and that's actually not impossible to resolve, is it? If you've got quite a small water pool or pond of water, you can protect them, and then you can get water from elsewhere for the stock. So I don't think it's impossible, but it's certainly difficult.
Comment back from Duncan. Thanks, Ian, and all the best with the cowpatch research too. From Susan Caldis. Thank you, Ian, for a really interesting lecture. I learned a lot. Congratulations on receipt of the award. Sorry I was on mute earlier and couldn't respond. Also, a comment from Ken Granger, back to you. Thank you, Ian, and thank you to the RGSQ for making this lecture so broadly available. We certainly hope to continue. I guess one benefit of this COVID problem is that we've all, moved forward with Zoom and so on and connecting with people all around Australia. So are there any further questions? I think that's the last one I can see, but do others have questions for Ian or comments? Maybe while people are still thinking, I think we still have a few more minutes, if we may, Ian. Perhaps I'll ask one more while people are thinking. One of the reasons that the committee felt you're, the best possible applicant for this award this year was that not only your geographical research, geomorphology and so on, very high-level academic work, but also you've been quite involved with geographical education, high school geography in particular in Victoria, bringing secondary and tertiary educators together. And you said that the new curriculum in Victoria, geography, appears to be reinvigorating school geography, which is wonderful. So for the geography teachers who are in our audience this evening, could you comment on how geography is going in Victoria?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I am pretty heavily involved with the Geography Teachers Association of Victoria. I was involved in the new curriculum, the new VCE curriculum, which I think is it had been 40 years actually since that had been refreshed. And yeah, we are seeing an increase in student numbers going into the years 11 and 12. And the GTAV is extremely active in across the state, and the conference has been always very large. So that's a good sort of a measure for us. We have about 500 people going to the conference. I think it's the largest geography conference in the Southern Hemisphere, actually. And unless there's a bigger one in Cape Town or Rio de Janeiro or somewhere, but it hasn't been so good this year with all the COVID problems. I think it's knocked the organisation around in terms of its because we have great meetings, get-togethers, and yeah, I think it's suffered in the process. I'd say the two things I'd mention about the geography that are very positive. One is a big focus on primary school geography, which we've tended to ignore in the past. And so that's getting good curriculum material down to even first grade, because they have to have just as good material as VCE, whereas we've tended to always emphasise the other, the older age groups. The second thing is the out-of-field teachers, and I know Susan is an expert in this area and much better equipped than me to talk about it. But because 40% of geography teachers are out of field, they're not trained in geography sufficiently, and we do have a program in the GTAV for training those out of field teachers and getting them some accreditation. And I think that's an exciting development, because that's a big problem for geography across the whole country.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. There's one more comment come through, and it's from an iPad, so I don't know who it's from. It says, "Go north and you have a job for a very long life. Thanks for the info." Well, unless anyone else has a question there for Ian, we might wind up gradually. So I'd like to once again thank Ian for a wonderful presentation this evening. I was, particularly impressed with the way you organised it in the history of our relationships with relationship with rivers, those 4 stages, 4 acts. So clear, really, that how things have changed historically, and from your long experience working with riparian zones. That was a really eye-opening way to present the material, so thank you. And once again, congratulations from all of us at the RGSQ for the award this year. And as I said, we hope to bring you to Brisbane next year. So could everybody who's listening, a round of applause, Zoom applause to Ian. Thank you so much. And I can see all the claps coming up there. Yes, Neil O'Connor was the iPad. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks very much, Rafni, and thanks for the award, and thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Yes. And we have recorded this evening, so others may catch up on it. Thanks again, everybody, for attending this evening. And stay safe, stay well, everyone. Thank you. Good night.